Hi, I'm Sue Whatman. I'm from the School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University, and I'm talking today about a research program called Pedagogic Codes and Pedagogic Rights, which is situated in the Educational Justice, Equity and Excellence program of our research institute. My paper I'm going to speak about today looks at the way health education knowledge is recontextualised for Indigenous students at a particular school in a remote part of Australia. This paper comes from the journal Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy and is drawing upon some central concepts from Bernstein's theoretical lens to evaluating curriculum pedagogy and evaluation. Well, Basil Bernstein was a sociologist of education who had a particular interest in unpacking or decoding schooling and also particularly for children who benefited least from schooling. So his legacy or his major contribution to schooling is to describe it as a pedagogic relay, and that in this relay you are further decoding messages, interrelated message systems, and these are curriculum, pedagogy and evaluation. So my paper looked particularly at what happens when you start to unpack the pedagogic relay in a particular site. And it drew upon a couple of central concepts that we thought would be useful to talk about today, because they're usually the starting point when you want to dive in and learn a little bit more about Bernstein. A lot of people have asked me, how did I end up where I am today with this trail of work in Indigenous education, in health and physical education. I was a health and physical education teacher, but I started working in Indigenous education at a university student support centre. And like most non-Indigenous Australians, my own level of understanding about Australia's race relations and history of treatment of Indigenous peoples and education was pretty limited until I started working at this centre. So I had already come out of finishing a master's degree looking at curriculum decision making in health and physical education, and quickly realised that what a lot of people are worried about in curriculum decision making, they don't have the Indigenous learner in their mind, and they don't have the priorities and imperatives for Indigenous communities at the forefront of their mind when they're making these decisions on their behalf or for them. So that led me to my research topic, which was to look at, well, how does Indigenous community get involved with making educational decisions for Indigenous students? So my PhD topic was, it was a case study looking at community participation in decision making for health education for girls. And that then led to working with my supervisor, Professor Parlo Singh, and bringing Bernstein in as a theoretical lens to make sense of the clear and obvious power relations that are going on in educational decision making for Indigenous students. The argument that he's put forth about parents having the right or a democratic stake in their children's education, and that a lot of his research with children from working class backgrounds in England had shown that parents did not have that right. They didn't have a democratic stake in their children's education because they had no power and control over what was happening in education for their children. So the concepts about unpacking these power and control relations were completely suitable to look at a similar situation in Australia where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents and communities weren't able to exercise their democratic right to have a say over education for their own children. Classification and framing, sometimes when you are reading it for the first time you think, oh, what is that? Do I look at that? Is that content? Is that something I'm going searching for in a school? And no, the answer is no. What they are, Bernstein created the idea of classification and framing, and let's talk about classification first, as an analytical concept to help you unpack the structures of schooling. So classification and framing are two ways in which you unpack what is going on in the educational or the pedagogic relay. So the thing about classification is it's not a what. You're not going looking for a classification in schooling. This is an analytical concept, and it's designed to focus your attention on the relations between other things. So it's looking at the nature of the differentiation between contents. And if you think of contents as, let's just think of it most simply as subjects, differentiation perhaps between subjects in a school. So he then posed the idea that classification then is either strong or weak, which means then that those relations or the differentiation between contents is either very strongly divided or bounded, or separated from other contents, or if they're weak, they're not. They're actually open to other contents. For example, there are subjects at school that you would say are very well insulated from other subjects. An example might be physics. Physics has a very, very well-defined content, has a particular way of teaching it. The teachers who teach it strongly identify with not only the subject matter but how you should properly teach it, and that we would say that classification in physics is quite strong. So the opposite of that, so an example then perhaps of a subject that you would say isn't strongly classified would be something like the social sciences. So social science becomes an umbrella term for things like geography and history rolled together, or political studies and women's studies and environmental education, and that how you kind of choose what you put into social science isn't going to be resisted or isn't going to be disputed as saying that's not social science, you can't teach those things together, because those contents are more open to each other to be put together in a way that the teacher decides is best. Classification not only refers to, say, official knowledge that's taught in a subject, it's also used to describe the relation between what you might call everyday knowledge, and not only the everyday knowledge of the teacher, but the everyday knowledge of the students. So there can be a very strong classification or strong boundaries around what teachers consider as everyday knowledge and what students consider as everyday knowledge. The second analytical concept of framing, so you talk about classification and framing together, helps you understand that even though something can be very strongly classified and have very insular contents and stand alone, the framing then lets you look at, what's the context and what are the pedagogical relationships that are in that context, and therefore what are the communication flows going on in that context. So you can still be working in a strongly classified part of the curriculum, but the relationships in that particular side of that context actually allow you to describe it as weakly framed. So what that means then, so for an example from my study in this paper, if you were to look at a subject like physical education or health education, as I did, it has been described in the literature as a strongly classified subject area, because people have very strong opinions about what it should be in there, how it should be taught, and the particular type of person who's the right person to teach it. However, if you are then in a context such as in an Indigenous community school, and you are working with lots of different people with different understandings of, what is health education? What is physical education? How is the best way to teach it? We think this should be taught over that. And then you also have other things or other structures in place that allow those communication flows to disrupt those very strong and firm ideas which might otherwise be fixed about how health education should be taught. What you'll then see is that it will look quite different to the way health education is taught in another side, because the framing has allowed you to negate the strong classification of that subject. An example of how knowledge finds its way through these relations or through and the relations that are derived from the context that you're in might be that community knowledge about or women's knowledge about the best way or what you should learn in something like health education is going to be taught, and it's going to find its way into that classroom, whereas in another setting with different people and different context, it wouldn't. So it doesn't actually matter. He didn't derive these conceptual tools from working only with Indigenous people or only with Jewish people in England or people from working class backgrounds in England. What he's done is to devise a set of tools that let you boil right down to the very interpersonal, micro-level, one-to-one power and control relations that are going on in any context. And I found that I could do that with Indigenous education research.